Hi, everyone. Welcome to Author Tidbits. That's what it is. I'm sure everyone watches these and is like, seriously, this is like the fourth one you've said. I don't even know what the name of this is. But it's like once I start, then the problem here's the problem. I'm going to be straight with you, is that there's also the Sweet Regency Romance Facebook group that I do some of these for sometimes, and they're called Regency Ramblings. So then when I start saying welcome to, then I start thinking ramblings, and that's not it. And I know it's not it, but whatever. Anyway, it just means people will actually know how like I really am in real life, right? IRL, kind of just that's how I am. So anyway, welcome to Author Tidbits with my very good friend, Laura Beers. How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Good. Now, Laura is fresh off a trip from London, so prepared to be amazed, right?
I don't know. I'm pretty jet lagged. I woke up at 2:00 this morning and I was up for 4 hours and then I took a power nap. I've taken a few power naps today. So
yeah. So are you getting writing done at 2?
I do. I get up and I write half a chapter and then I go back to bed and then I think of the next half chapter and then I hopefully will be able to write that. So I'm getting writing done.
Well, that's the best, right?
Yeah. Well, it's actually, I'm kind of at this point in my book where, and I probably shouldn't admit this, but as I'm writing my book, I'm like, I originally had who the killer was going to be. And then I thought, I think this person should be the killer. So I really don't know who the killer is. So it's going to be a surprise to me.
Don't you love that?
Yeah.
I had that happen once where I was like, never saw that one coming. Well, there you go.
I even introduced another character and I'm like, that person will be the killer. And then I thought, no, I don't think so. I like that character too much. So we shall see. Yeah.
I know. I started with these bad guys that I knew they were going to be the bad guys. And then they didn't, I mean, they were still bad guys, but they weren't the bad guys.
Yeah.
Which, go figure that one. Yeah. So I feel you on that. All right. So speaking of bad guys,
yes,
we are going to be talking today about Regency Spies, which is like a whole almost subgenre itself, right? Within, or I guess, well, I don't know, maybe it's just trope, its own trope. But so my first question is, maybe people don't know the difference, but is there a difference between like your typical Regency Spy and maybe your Bow Street Runner or Bow Street?
So there is a difference. One of the things is there's not a lot written about Regency spies. So a lot of it is kind of based upon doing research. I have a few books of like Wellington spies. I'm not sure if you can see. They actually have a Regency Spies book.
Oh.
And then they have, of course, one of my favorite books, Washington Spies.
I love Washington Spies.
Because he has his own network and he was amazing. But spies typically work for the Crown, and Bow Street Runners, they were the precursor of the police force. Right. So a lot of the times they were more of like, I consider them more of like an investigator in the sense that the wealthy people could hire them. So they would handle crimes. They mostly did petty crimes because the people who actually did murders were the constables, which is more of a political position. So sometimes they would bring in Bow Street Runners to consult on that and do that. But most of the time, the Bow Street Runners did more of the kind of the petty crime, or they would sometimes go undercover and listen for like rebels and all that stuff because they were paid on what type of people they could bring in. So the criminals could bring in. So they were actually paid to like find crime, to root out crime and bring it back in. And they were paid.
They might overlap with spies then.
Mm-hmm. So they would. So a lot of the times my spies don't necessarily like the Bow Street Runners because they're for hire. But in my books, because I write about lords and ladies, the spies come from, they're like the son of a duke or son of an earl. But back then it was very distasteful for a spy to be a spy. So someone from gentry or peer, they wouldn't have been a spy. That is recorded.
Right.
Yeah.
Although you have to think about it, and I'm sure there were some, Because really and truly, who would suspect it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so.
It's true.
But they also would have the power to kind of, I think, keep it hush hush, maybe more than.
Well, and like my favorite story is Washington. He used a whole network of spies, and he actually used females for spies. And most of it, they were never detected, according to the records. None of them ever were caught, any of the females. And the reason why they suspect is because the English didn't use female spies, but the French used female spies. So that's well documented. Right. So that's why I'm sitting here thinking, I bet the English also used female spies. They just didn't come down to Washington's plan.
Well, and I think maybe they protected them or their identity maybe a little bit more, so it never was documented.
And they are typically, from my research that I discovered, they're like agent like A or agent B, according to documentation. So they were never, their names are never ever written down. It was always just agent A or agent C. So I've used that. And we don't know a lot about how the network worked. So that's where a lot of the interpretation comes in with authors on whether or not they have a spy master, whether or not it's through home office. There's not a lot of information on that.
So and really, and truly, it could be it could be a myriad of those, right? Mm-hmm. Depending on the situation and depending on, I would guess there might be some who would, some spies who would report directly to the crown.
Mm-hmm. That's typically what we have. And sometimes people call them agents of the crown. That's also another one. So they're called spies or agent of the crown.
I think the agent of the crown might have been to like legitimize them a little bit more, right? So I think if you're writing if you've got maybe the second son of a noble or a younger son of a noble, maybe he's going to choose to go by agent of the crown because it maybe sounds a little more proper.
Yes.
Than saying spy. That's interesting.
And that's one of the funny things is because it was considered distasteful, someone in the family you wouldn't necessarily know. So if one of the sons chose a profession to be a spy, they wouldn't talk about it. So a lot of the times their cover could be like they're the bad boy, they're a rake,
which happens a lot, I think.
Yeah. And so they have a cover of some sort of why they are gone all the time or why they're doing stuff. Right. So.
Well, and I think the other one that's probably used a lot as cover is the fop. The one who's just like all about their clothes and,
dandy,
the dandy. Exactly. Yeah. So, okay. So let me ask you this. Why was being a spy distasteful?
Because you're spying on other people. It was kind of frowned upon. Like that
even when it was foreign.
Yeah. Well, maybe so much foreign, but for your people, a lot of the agents of the crown, they would go to these taverns or these pubs and they would listen for these rebel plots. And they would, because there were rebel plots for everything. It was just insane how many plots were going around. And so because of that, it was kind of distasteful to spy on your neighbor, spy on your friends. And so it was kind of looked down upon. Gotcha. And so especially if you're a peer in the peer, or if you're one of the sons, it's kind of like distasteful to do. Like you should do something more respectable, like be a barrister or a vicar. Don't be a spy. But we have to have spies because spies are
otherwise you don't know these things, right? Mm-hmm. Otherwise plots aren't rooted out and quashed before they happen.
Yes. And they would, like I said, a lot of times I have my characters, because typically if you're from the wealthier class, you dress wealthier. So most of the time they have clothes like plain brown clothes, scratchy clothes, so they could blend in. But it's also, they had to change the way they spoke. They had to change all that stuff to fit in. So it wasn't something that you could all of a sudden just be like, oh, I want to be an agent. And then you just go for it. You actually had to have some learning to blend in.
Well, and you would also, I would suppose, have to have some sort of connections. Because because I think your everyday person who's like, hey, I'm going to be a spy, then almost becomes like more of a plotter than a spy, right? I mean,
So
that's
we had,
interesting.
so actually most of the time my spies get recruited out of Oxford
Mm-hmm.
or
Why
Cambridge.
Oxford? Is it usually Oxford, or is it kind of just either?
Just either.
Oh, okay.
Just they're recruited when they're younger. So and
But
then
out of university, because
yeah, but
there's
then
intelligence there.
yeah, you meet them when they're later. So I've never had someone who just became a spy. It's always like 5 or 10 years later. They've been a spy. They're like more of a, a veteran spy.
Mm-hmm.
So because yeah, there's a huge learning curve. And I think part of it is I always wanted to be a spy, so I write about spies.
Yeah.
But I'm not smart enough to be a spy. So I was thinking about that. I was like, if I was ever a spy, I'd be killed like by the first person like who I came across.
So answer me this.
Mm-hmm.
What if it's such a distasteful occupation?
Mm-hmm.
What were the motives, or why would someone who was maybe came from gentry or nobility, why would they even consider doing it?
Just to serve king and country.
Okay, so it's
Matter of
a
honor.
patriotism kind of thing.
Yeah, it would be a matter of honor and respect for the country, for the crown.
Okay.
So
now, so I have this question too.
yes.
See, I told you I'd have more questions. Have you seen any or come across any titles that have been given out to spies because of what they uncovered? Have you ever come across that?
I have not ever come across that, because most of the time they don't, especially at least in Regency time period. Like I said, their names were never written down. They're written down as like Agent A or B or C. So I'm sure someone knows their real identities, but no one that I in my research has become knighted or anything because of that.
That's interesting, because they give. I mean, you hear all the time of people being given titles for war. You see them from military. I mean, that's how.
And Wellington spies, maybe, but yeah, because he had a network of spies, but no one.
Well, because wasn't it Wellington's brother that was a noble, and then Wellington himself was given a title? Was it Wellington?
Yes,
or
Duke
was
of
it
Wellington?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, his brother was the Duke, and even Wellington, then after the war, was given his own title, right?
Yeah.
That's interesting. Although, I don't know, maybe there are some, but they were listed as other reasons for getting it.
Yes.
Maybe, I don't know. That's interesting.
And the Duke of Wellington obviously was a war hero. I mean, what he did was amazing. And I actually saw where he was buried in the tomb. So
yeah,
it was kind of fun.
Yeah. That's interesting. So they still don't know any of his actual spies' names then, for reals? Like, there's no place that it's been published as to who his spies actually were, just code names, huh?
Code names, yeah.
Because that's not the case with Washington's, right?
Right. Washington's actually, he went and like had dinner with some of them, and he thanked them, and they were well known. But it's been a while since I've read Wellington Spies, but I might need to go back and confirm that. But yeah, there's not a list of people it's not like there's a list in that book.
Which is, I guess, safer.
Yeah.
So, okay. So in your books, do you have women that are spies then?
Yes, I do.
So how do they function differently than your male spies?
Well, actually, that's one of the reasons why I started writing. Was I read a book about a female spy, and she was not very good. And I was like, whoa. If you're a female spy in the Regency time period, you've got to be pretty awesome. Like, you've got to be on top of your game, and especially if you're a lady. And so that's one of the reasons why that first story, Saving Shadow, in my head was about a female spy. But obviously they have different rules because they're ladies. They can't just up and leave. They can't just do certain things. So most of the time they have a partner of some sort, or someone that kind of helps them with their cover. And the reason why someone's courting them, or there's a reason why they can get up and, like, instead of going to Hyde Park on a ride, they go see the spy master. or something like that. So most of the time they have a brother that knows, or their close confidant that knows their real identity to help out.
I was going to say, because their lives are not their own.
Mm-mm.
So it's not like they can just be like, well, I've just decided I'm going to visit such and such, And they can't be alone with a man. How do you handle that? Because usually it's probably a man that is their partner, right?
Most of the time, like in the first one, Saving Shadow, her brother was her partner. And then she was assigned a different partner. And so that went a little different. But most of the time it's a brother of some sort. So the brother would escort her somewhere and the other gentleman would come along.
Okay. Because you kind of have to, I mean, my guess would be back then they probably didn't have, I mean, they just kind of, if the women were involved, then they just kind of took the risk. Because I guess if you're spying, you're already at risk. So what's your reputation, right?
Well, and women, I think it was probably more common than we realized. Like what they talked about is because a lot of these women hosted parties, and women were not very smart. I mean, according to a lot of the men, we obviously know that women are very smart, but so they could just come in and listen and just kind of listen to things being said and then depart, and no one would really notice their presence because it was just a woman. Yeah. So I bet they listened a lot more than what we realized.
Yeah, I would guess. But I mean, that would be similar with the servants too. Most servants were very invisible.
Yes.
But I'm sure they knew a lot.
Oh, yeah, they did. But my books always go around lords and ladies.
Yeah, so mine do too. Yeah. I'm with you on that one.
But there was one time the butler was the bad guy and he was a spy.
Did it?
One time I did. My brother's like, you should really have the butler do it. And I'm like, I'm not going to have the butler do it. And then I thought, that's a really good idea. So in one of my books, out of my 44 books, the butler did it. So
how many of your 44 books are spy?
Oh, that is a good question.
Because you have quite a few spy ones.
I do have most of the time
you have several series, right?
Yeah, I have in my books, I have a lot of like mystery and intrigue. And so typically because of that, you need either a Bow Street runner or a spy. And so you need something in there to help move along the plot if someone's murdered or something happens. Right. So that's the reason why I always typically have at least one or two. I do have the first series I did, Saving Shadow, that one, all of them were spies. Like they were all interwoven and everything. And then I have a couple series that don't have spies. And then I have ones that just one or two characters are the spies and they're intermingled. So in my current one, I have, right now I'm writing the story about the Bow Street runner. He was a second son. His brother was murdered and he is now the heir. So he has to give up being a Bow Street runner. Before he does that, he has to solve this murder of his brother.
Now Bow Street runners weren't really super highly looked upon either, though, were they?
Mm-hmm. They were, like I said, like we would almost kind of, I mean, obviously they were the precursor to the police force.
Right.
They were kind of like a private eye. Like, I mean, you could hire them.
But they weren't considered gentlemen, were they?
No, they were not.
That's what I thought. Yeah. So it would still be much more palatable to be a vicar or a barrister.
Yeah. Yeah. It was not a profession anyone aspired to. It was just kind of, I mean, for a gentry or a peer, it's not something they aspired to.
Right. Okay. That's interesting. So, I had a question. Now it's gone. Anyway. So in doing your research, have you come across, I mean, do you have a favorite spy? Do you have one that you kind of are like, oh, that's my guy?
I hate to say it though, but I mean, I know this sounds weird, but my favorite spy is the first spy I wrote about, Eliza, which I know she's a fictional character, but that I did a lot of research on different spies and everything. And I just wrote her that. So I know she's fictional and, not real, but she would be my favorite spy over any Because if you read all of these books that I have, none of them have female spies in it.
So, even your Washington one doesn't, huh?
Well, they talk about what they did.
Right.
Like, but they wasn't like, they did kind of, so like some of the stuff that they did was when like the troops are coming into town, they would hang up their laundry.
Right.
And so people would see that and that give them signs. So there wasn't
right. And if they up the black bloomers, then it meant something. Yes. And right.
So it was more strategic. So right. It wasn't that, but it was a lot of men, mostly men, that they talked about.
That's interesting. So when you're writing, do you tend to take several spies you've read about and kind of amalgamate them into one? Or do you ever have any of the actual spies as secondary or?
So I'm very careful about writing real spies, about real spies. Like I'll reference, Wellington, like a bunch of people, I'll reference them, but I'm very careful about writing about a real life spy, just because, or a real life situation. Although, like the Guy Fawkes,
right.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. All that stuff. That stuff kind of has some truth to it. And, I kind of worked with that. But I'm very careful about writing about a real life spy.
And the real situation.
Yeah. Just like I'm very careful I'm starting to, not at the beginning, but writing about a real person by using a real title, but not contributing it to that real person. It's just, I was using that title kind of as a person, not as a real person, if that makes sense.
Yeah. See, I don't use real titles.
Yeah.
I mean, in fact, I Google search to make sure a title I'm using isn't an actual title. I'm okay if it's like, if I'm using it as like the Earl of Chambray and there is a Viscount Chambray. Mm-hmm. I'm okay with that because, I'm not saying they're the same. They're
right.
It's different enough. But if I've got a title and I'm like, no, change it.
Well, and it wasn't until I took your class on titles that I even realized how they got their titles. So I learned, okay, so this is what I do. So I get to a map and then I look at names, or
that's
places.
What I do too.
And I'm like, that would be an interesting, Earl of so-and-so, and that's what I do.
Thank you, Lyra Bears. You're awesome. Lyra's books are awesome. 44. I'm still just baffled by that and quite impressed. Don't forget to subscribe so that whenever anything new drops, then you will be notified. I'm just going to say there might be a new book narration coming out, hopefully this month. Hopefully, right? Hopefully it comes early. So just teasing that might happen. Anyway, so thanks for joining us and we'll see you next time. Bye.